relied on this grassroots WASP base for people who would certainly vote for their candidates, who would perhaps subscribe to their magazines, and so on and so forth. And yet, they never really wanted to defend this group. They never explicitly wanted to defend it as a class or as a people. And you see this throughout the people most admired by the conservative movement, such as Russell Kirk or Harry Jaffa, and various other luminaries like this. They basically wanted to, they had a kind of anti-historicist notion that they weren't actually defending the WASP founding stock of the United States, that in fact they were defending these kind of eternal values or actually what Russell Kirk said, they had an ontic status. That is, they were independent and kind of internal, and that was regardless of the people holding them. So they basically had these notions of themselves. I think Harry Jaffa had determined that really to be an American you needed a commitment to equality, and commitment should be remind one of engagé, a kind of leftist appeal. So in some ways the what you see with the conservative movement is this attempt not to defend bourgeois America, and instead to kind of have these pretenses of defending eternal values. And in some ways they became a kind of conservative version of the left. They had their own rights of man. They had their own demands that to be an American is to embrace equality and things like that. And they didn't in some ways stick up for us, so to speak. They stuck up for some value system that they were creating. And you can also see how easily a movement like this, well, before I say that, you could also see that in some ways when you have this left liberal value, when you have this kind of eternal value system that you create, this ontic system of values, and in some ways has nowhere else to slide but left. A lot of the left liberals love to point out how these crazy reactionary opinions that William Buckley had when he was a young man, and things like that. The conservative movement opposed civil rights. They wanted to repeal the New Deal, and so on and so forth. But I think what's actually more telling is not so much that they had these opinions at one point, but that they could so easily slide to new ones. It's the Buckleyite movement could at one point say, we're going to get rid of the New Deal, we dislike this MLK guy, and then a mere 10 years will pass, and they'll be deifying Martin Luther King as a conservative theologian, and talking about, how we need to preserve the welfare state and preserve Medicare. When you're a conservative yet you're really not defending a particular order or social order, you have these values that can just float, which way, this way and that, and certainly in our context, they have just, almost inevitably shifted left. Of course, there is one thing that the conservative movement has defended staunchly, and that is the warfare state aspect. And if you think of the new right as it came with Goldwater and things like this, they spoke a lot about constitutionalism, about getting rid of the welfare state. They also spoke a lot about rolling back communism. This transferred into rolling back Islam or something like this. And if you want to think about cultural or libertarian conservatives who latched on to this movement, they in many ways should be considered full idiots, to use the Leninist term in an ironic manner. The conservative movement has done absolutely nothing for them, and they've done pretty much everything for things like the military-industrial complex. Okay, so that's basically, I think that's how I talk about conservatism in America. And I want to focus on a few things that really separate the alternative right and why we're different, and why we are kind of questioning these values of the conservative movement in a very fundamental way. And I'm going to talk about this in terms of HBD, human biodiversity. The information age has certainly become an age of public outrage. You have certainly every week, there's some various race or gender scandal that goes on. If perhaps the Duke lacrosse case would be one that happened a couple of years ago that's pretty evident. And usually the right wing in America can be relied upon to criticize these things. You can usually rely upon them to kind of point out the obvious and say that, no, Al Sharpton's a bad guy, he's ridiculous. You shouldn't just indulge in white guilt and say that it's really slavery that keeps everyone down, and that's why we have income or educational gaps, and that a new social program is actually not going to help black people. It might very well, these new welfare programs will very well hurt them, and so on and so forth. They can usually be relied to point out the obvious. But what's important here is that the right always criticizes the left's race obsessions within the context of its own Lysenkoism and version of multicultural togetherness. And if you put it another way, the right criticizes the left only within the horizon of egalitarianism. And therefore, what you really need for, say, African Americans, if they're not, achieving to the level of whites or Asians, is not a new welfare program, because that won't work. But instead, you need a kind of values therapy on them. They need to be taught about family values and constitutionalism, and soon they'll kind of rise up to the top. So basically, what the conservative movement has is its own egalitarian multicultural image of basically this kind of society of interchangeable individuals that are basically classless and ethnicity and raceless. And this goes back to this point of the American conservatism as basically a kind of version of the left. They have their own rights of man, and they have all this kind of stuff. I think basically what is very important, an important way to fight against this, and to fight against this on the most fundamental level, is a rational and a realistic understanding of race differences. And certainly Richard Len will be speaking on this, so I don't think I need to go into this much further. There's obvious, overwhelming amount of evidence of IQ differences between African Americans in America having usually an IQ of 85, Latinos, Hispanics somewhere in the 90 range, of white Americans as a kind of mean 100, usually Asians a little bit above that, and Jews a little bit above that. There's an overwhelming amount of evidence that this exists. There's also an overwhelming amount of genetic evidence that this exists. Now, I don't say any of this. I don't think understanding, say, IQ differences is going to be very good at white consciousness raising or thinking things like that. I think that is something that's the domain of poetry and literature and philosophy. Maybe I do think that having an understanding of this is essential as a counterattack against this ever-encroaching welfare state and the ever-expanding egalitarian ideology. I won't go in this because I don't want to go over. But certainly Marx, in his Gotha program, basically set out very explicitly that equal rights these are basically bourgeois rights, and they are unequal rights in the sense that there is a natural aristocracy of talent, there's a natural aristocracy of ability, and that basically these equal or bourgeois rights are going to lead to unequal outcomes and incomes. And in a sense, what he wanted in a communist society is that we would move beyond mere bourgeois equal rights, and we'd soon fly the banner of from each according to his capacity to each according to his need. In some ways, Marx should be praised for his honesty, in the sense that the typical leftist now, whenever you talk about, say, race differences or IQ, they think you're delusional or you're hateful or you're somehow crazy and should be locked up. Marx actually very much acknowledged the natural aristocracy of talent and ability, and he claimed that it must be crushed. When you think about Murray Rothbard, was certainly well aware of this fact and the importance of understanding race differences. If you look at his praise of, say, Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein's The Bell Curve, he asked the question of why we talk about race. And he said, if and when we as populists and libertarians abolish the welfare state in all its aspects, and property rights in the free markets are triumphant, many individuals and groups will predictably not like the end result. And that is the case, certainly a great deal of there might not be a black middle class, certainly, without the welfare state and federal employment. There are many people who benefit from that. And in this case, those ethnic and other groups who might be concentrated in lower income or less prestigious occupations, guided by their socialist mentors, will predictably raise the cry that the free market is evil and discriminatory, and that therefore collectivism is needed to redress the balance. In that case, the intelligence argument will become useful to defend the market economy and free society from ignorant or self-serving attacks. In short, racialist science is properly not an act of aggression or a cover for oppression of one group or another, but to the contrary, an operation in defense of private property and against assaults by aggressors. And I would just add, in closing of this section, that I would really say that the left liberal establishment, for them, race is of paramount importance. They think about it. They might not think about anything else. It was kind of interesting. There's a former Tony Blair speechwriter, and he admitted that their immigration policy in the late 90s and early 2000s was 100% about race. It had nothing to do with the economy. They actually hoped that the economy was big enough to kind of absorb all these third world undesirables that were brought into the country. And basically he wanted to, in his words, rub the right's face in diversity, to kind of build up so much diversity that they couldn't possibly get rid of it after about 10 years. So basically the left is always thinking about race. Many right-wing people don't want to think about it because it's mean and nasty, or it might mean you're a Nazi or something like that. And so the right might not want to think about race, but race is thinking about them. And you really can't choose where you fight battles. If you're being attacked by sea, you have to fight by sea. When you're being attacked by sea, you can't decide you're going to raise an army on land. And if you're being attacked in the racial question, you need to do a counterattack in the most fundamental aspect of that. And not, as I mentioned before, just splurt out this conservative movement version of egalitarianism, which is that other races just need new values and they'll become Americans. And if you see also, this kind of egalitarianism on the domestic level is in some ways a kind of inside out or a microcosm, macrocosm of American foreign policy, where it's anyone can become an American if they have the proper democratic values. And as well, we want to turn everyone into an American. By declaring war on them and establishing new parliaments and whatnot. Okay, I might go over by a couple of minutes. Oh, I'm okay. I'm going to end up just on talking a little bit about Austrian economics and how this also is connected with the alternative right as it's emerging in the United States. Sir Robert Walpole was probably he was a British prime minister in the 1720s. He was probably the inventor of imperial finance. And what he came up with this idea, if you have a steady stream of income, i.e. taxation, then you can basically keep buying, you can keep issuing bond after bond and keep paying the interest of these bonds. And every time a bond matures, you can just issue a new one. And that actually, you never have to ultimately repay the debt, and this can go on for infinity. And this is something that America has certainly learned this imperial lesson well. And if they've in some ways just put this on steroids, and if you add that with the kind of post-Bretton Woods system of the dollar as a world reserve currency, they have the ability to issue almost towards, they think, infinitely, perpetually issue more and more bonds and perpetually inflate, and that they're going to kind of get away with it.